I am honored to bring you this interview with Tracee Stanley today. In our interview, we discuss suffering and the necessity of being with and recognizing our individual suffering. Tracee shares about the experience of preparing to die through yoga and how liberation isn't a static experience. Tracee Stanley loves to share the practices of yoga nidra, meditation, self-empowerment, sankalpa, and self-inquiry. A teacher since 2001, she shares the unique practices of the Himalayan masters to guide students towards the door of awakening to their true nature, one that is full of luminosity, truth, wisdom, and bliss. She's the founder of Sankalpa Shakti Yoga School, creator of the Empowered Life Self-Inquiry Oracle, co-founder of Empowered Wisdom Yoga Nidra, and a partner in Pranamaya, an online yoga platform. I hope you enjoy this interview with Tracee. Hi, Tracee.
Hi, Michelle.
It's so good to see you.
It's good to see you too.
Yeah, thank you for saying yes to this conversation about collective grief and liberation. And I'm thrilled you're here.
I'm thrilled to be here. So thank you for inviting me. It's also very timely, so it's good.
Yeah. So we met about, I guess, a little over a year ago at the Asheville Yoga Festival, which I will never forget the moment we met, when I walked into that tent and there you were. And then I've had the opportunity at the last Asheville Yoga Festival to practice with you, and we've stayed in touch between the two festivals. And I'm just really honored to have a conversation with you, and deeply impacted by the work that you do in the world and your practice.
Thank you. As am I with your work as well, and bringing it into my trainings and having you come to, not come, but virtually come to speak to students. So thank you for everything that you're doing.
Yeah. And I would love for you to lead a moment of centering, speaking of practice, centering for us, so we can prepare for the conversation.
Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll do a mudra called Boob Mudra. So you're just going to take your two fingers, and if you're somewhere where you can press those fingers into the earth or onto something solid, you're just going to close your eyes. Take a deep, deep, full breath in. And exhale out with an audible sigh. So you almost feel as though your body is in this triangular shape where you can inhale and feel the vibration of the earth from the fingertips, and feel as though as you inhale, you're drawing it up the arms all the way to the crown of the head. And then as you exhale, exhale back down through the arms, through the fingertips, just feeling that you are connecting yourself to the earth. And just do that 2 more times. If it feels good for you to continue breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth, that is fine. Otherwise, you can start to breathe in through the nose and out through the nose. And just do that 3 more times. And on your next inhale in, just begin to sense your spine. You can see your spine as the trunk of your favorite tree. As you exhale, just feel and sense that the roots of that tree are growing down from the base of your spine into the earth. Reaching down, all the way down, miles down into the fiery core of the earth. And just feel yourself becoming more and more stable, grounded, supported, and connected. And slowly bring your awareness to your heart center and take a moment to offer gratitude for one thing, one person, one practice in your life that offers you support. When you feel ready to come out, just bring your hands together in Anjali Mudra and then slowly just begin to rub them together, becoming more brisk until you begin to feel heat between the hands. And then just slowly place your hands somewhere on your body where you would like to receive a healing, a blessing, an anointment, an honoring. Just be in gratitude for all that you are in this world. And when you feel ready to come back, you slowly just begin to let the eyes flutter open and take in the space around you, still feeling grounded, connected, and supported.
Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can share some about your work in the world, what you do, your practice. You just showed us what you do, the magic.
So my work in the world is really all about Sutra 136. So it's the sutra that tells us about the light that lives within us, that is eternal, that is beyond all sorrow, beyond all suffering, all conditioning. And it is something that when I read it and I started to receive teachings around it, around the practices around it, I felt like it was the one thing that I needed to share. And so while I share many different modalities of teaching, whether it's teaching through the wisdom of meditation or yoga nidra or the four desires, it's all with an aim to have us be able to touch that part of ourselves. That's the easiest way I can sum it up.
Mm-hmm. And why do you feel like that verse spoke to you? Like at the time it spoke to you, because it sounds like it was profound, right? And shaped everything.
It was very profound. So Vishoka ma jyotishmati is the verse, but it was the first time that I had ever read an in-depth book on yoga, and I didn't know what I was picking up to read. I had only been practicing yoga for about 5 years, and I was going on my first yoga retreat, and I thought, oh, this is great. I'll just go to the Bodhi tree and pick up something on yoga, and this looks interesting. So I started reading, and when I got to that verse, or that sutra, it was so profound to think that there was a part of me that was always radiant and powerful and free. And that I knew that that was not the experience that I was having in the everyday, but that I had glimpsed maybe just a little bit of the shine through my practice, like in those feelings of feeling bliss and feeling weightless, but it was temporary. And it felt like it was something that was just an effect of the practice and not something that was actually a static condition. And so that just fascinated me. And then I started to look for teachers who could lead me towards what I thought was the promise of the Yoga Sutras, was really the realization of that, and yoga really beyond the postures And that just changed the trajectory of me wanting to practice and how I was practicing, and then also the desire to be a teacher.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, you know, the focus of this conversation or this summit is about grief and liberation. And I feel like part of your practice and your work is, I think you're making space for people to grieve and feel that light and liberation that spoke to you through that sutra. And so I'm wondering why you feel like it might be important to center a process or conversation about collective grief and liberation at this time.
Well, I mean, I really feel that let's talk about collective liberation first. And what does that look like? I really feel like it has to start on the individual level. That's my belief. And that starting on the individual level really starts with admitting that you're suffering. Right? And then once you can admit that you're suffering, then you also then have to make the choice that you want to change something. And you also then have to have the faith that it's possible that something can change. Right? And if you have faith that something can change, then you have to really define and know what it is that you actually have faith in. Right? And then start to move towards that. And so if there are people in your community or there's leaders in your community that may have answers that can point you towards that, then you have to seek them out. Right? And so once you seek them out and you actually receive those teachings or that support or that guidance, whatever form that's coming in, you have to continue having faith. But at the same time, you also have to put in self-effort. I don't believe there's any such thing as waving a magic wand or having one practice and all of a sudden something's going to shift. I think that the discipline and the self-effort and the courage of being able to face the pain of it and maybe understanding that pain in a different way through practice is something that helps us to become liberated. But, and I'm just speaking from what I believe, but this is not, but I also feel like when it comes to collective liberation, that once we, let's say, become liberated in some way, I do not believe that that is a static condition, because the world around us is constantly changing and things are constantly happening. And so it's really a dynamic practice that we always have to be moving in and out of. And I think that maybe there are gradations of liberation that allow us to move closer to having that collective. But the work to me is really allowing people to have a mirror and a place to be able to feel brave enough to be able to face the pain. And we can only do that, I believe, really effectively in community. Right. So, I before this call, knowing that we were going to be talking about this, I actually looked up the etymology of the word grief. And one of the things that I found was that in French, it comes from the word grever, which means a burden. Right. And so it's like you think about how many times when someone's grieving, do they feel like a burden? Yeah. And then in Old English in the 1200s, it was meaning to endure something endure some sort of suffering alone and in silence. And so I feel like that meaning has been transferred to us in some way, that when you're grieving, you have to do it in silence. You have to suffer by yourself because you don't want to drag other people down. But what I see just in working with, groups of people is that when people get together and they acknowledge their suffering, and they do it like in dyads or in group, the realization is that we're all suffering, and our suffering is not different from one another. It's deep and it's painful, and it's in that acknowledgement and seeing that mirrored in another person and accepted, and being able to have someone who can hold the space of seeing you suffer without wanting to run away is very healing. And so I feel like our collective liberation just lies in understanding that it's dynamic and that we have to hold each other.
Yeah, and it sounds like and an acknowledgement of suffering, right? Like we have to acknowledge that.
If you don't acknowledge that, you can't go anywhere.
Right, right. Is there an experience of that in your own life that you could share about, where you've had to turn towards your suffering in order to get free, like in order to?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a very visceral experience of this. And the reason why this conversation is so timely is because my dad's birthday was on December 13th, which is not too many days since we're doing this.
Right.
And he passed away 7 years ago. And one of the things that really stands out to me is maybe about a month and a half after he passed away, and it was a very painful experience, not only because he passed away, but because there was strife in the family at that time. And so there was a lot of hiding of information and about his health and what was actually happening. And so I was having to intuit a lot of things. And that just kind of added onto the grief already. And so about a month and a half after he passed, I was in a Yoga Nidra workshop with Richard Miller. And one of the practices that he asked us to do was to find an emotion, a negative emotion that was present in our body. And so the first thing that I was like looking, right? Like inwardly looking for what this thing was. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. You've taken that little ball of grief and you placed it somewhere in the body in order to just be able to get on with it, to get on with your day, right? And then occasionally when you're by yourself, you allow this ball of grief to come up so that you can process. And now here you are in this room of like 60 people, and you're being asked to find this thing. And so it was one of the I look at this as being like the acknowledgement part, right? Like, oh, I have to acknowledge the grief is there. I've tucked it away. Let me now bring it forward. And now I actually have to decide, do I have faith in this practice to be able to help me to process or move through what's going to come up, and to have the courage to be okay that if I bust out into tears in this workshop, that's also okay, and that I can be held in some way. And then it was like the self-effort to actually move into that space and see and be with the grief that was very, very deep and very painful. And then he asked us to find the opposite emotion. And the opposite emotion that I came up with was joy and bliss. And then he basically asked us to kind of move between those two places in the body, because joy was living somewhere else, grief was living somewhere else, and to move between those two places. And the feeling of joy and bliss was so profound, as was the feeling of grief. And moving between those two, it was like, oh, I can hold both of these at the same time. And not only can I hold both of these at the same time, but what does that mean if I'm holding both of these at the same time? It really means that I'm not defined by my grief. My grief doesn't have that control over me. And after the practice was over, you know, I went to him and I said, oh, so this is like where the pairs of opposites can begin to cease to exist. And he said, yeah. And so it was like, okay, so I'm having an embodied experience of this and understanding that I'm not defined by the grief. It doesn't have the ability to take me over unless I actually let it do that. So that was a very profound experience for me, to be able to have in my body that I can feel it even now, because it was so powerful.
And what lessons came from that experience of not having to like be with the polarity of joy and grief, but actually just to hold both at the same time? Like, what lessons have rippled out from that for you in your life?
More of a flow, more of an allowing, right? And also less shame around having grief in the first place. You know, I learned at a very early age that you're not supposed to show emotion, and you kind of just get on with it. And that was, you know, I literally, up until my dad got much older, I never saw him cry, except for once when my mom had a stillborn child, and they didn't tell us really anything about what was going on. And I just saw him with one tear, and that was it. And so that somehow I kind of got this lesson that it's not okay to really grieve, you know? And so that was something that I had to unpack for myself, to, you know, it's not a sign of weakness to grieve. It's not anything that we need to be ashamed about. And in fact, it's not anything to be ashamed about when you feel moments of joy, because I think that there's judgment when, you know, someone has passed away, and I've heard it, I'm sure we all have heard it, you know, where someone's like, oh my God, I can't believe she's laughing at the funeral, or I can't believe that, you know, she's out doing this or going on vacation, you know, whatever it is. It's like, we don't have the right to judge someone else's process, because they may be already in that space of realizing that they can hold both of those things, and that the joy is healing and the grief is also healing.
Yeah, and sometimes laughter's medicine, you know?
100%, yeah.
Like that, what you just said made me think of my dad passed away. It's been 2 years now. And the day of his memorial, my grandmother had a stroke in front of me, and I'm in the ambulance going to the hospital with her. And the ambulance driver said, what did you do today? And I was like, we went to my dad's memorial. And then he just looked at me, and I just started laughing, because I was like, this is like bizarre that this is happening. And it was, I mean, it was just like, this is what I need to do in this moment, because this feels like it doesn't make any sense at all. But laughter can be, we feel all of it. It's like we have a full range of emotion, you know, but sometimes we're conditioned not to acknowledge that.
Yeah. And I do agree. I think that laughter is, and those people who are leaving us behind, if we want to say that in one aspect, they want us to be joyful. They want us to remember their lives, right? And their love. Yeah.
Yeah. 100% for sure. So are there rituals or practices you engage to move through grief, to find joy, or to flow with both at the same time?
Well, one of the practices that I was given was a practice around the cave of the heart, right, where this light resides. And it was a practice from Pandit Rajmani Tiganayat at the Himalayan Institute. And I had found out about this practice from one of my teachers, And he told the story about how there was, this is secondhand, so someone was there, they can correct me on what exactly happened, but it was something around, there was a snowstorm of some kind that had happened at the Institute, and a couple had gotten news that their son had been in an accident and had passed away. And they went to seek out, so they acknowledged their suffering and they went to seek out a teaching that would help them. And they received this practice called the Cave of the Heart. And Panditji talks about it in his book, The Secret of the Yoga Sutras, in the section of 136. But it's really a practice of allowing your awareness to move deep, deep into this cave, where there's said that there's a cave of the heart where this light exists, and doing a practice with mantra inside of that cave that really brings forth a lot of gratitude and peace and bliss, and it's very healing. And so that is a practice that I have done often when I've been in times of grief, or that I've shared with private students when they've been going through something difficult, and it's very effective. And it's, to me, everything is about the heart, tapping into that heart space, you know, being with your pets and with your loved ones and other people who've been through the same thing that you've been through, because they understand what it feels like. And also, you know, not making sure that you're not around people who don't understand or have a tendency to say things that are insensitive. I don't think there's anything wrong with avoiding people who are insensitive when you're in moments of and times of grief and healing.
Yeah, and being able to set those boundaries. I really appreciate that, because I think sometimes people feel like they can't set boundaries or really do what they need to do to take care of themselves when they're grieving, and just the permission to not be around people who are insensitive, right? Or to show up to something and then leave because it's not actually where you need to be, right? And to change your mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because that's kind of the nature of grief. It's sort of what it does, in my experience, moment to moment. My emotional state shifts.
It's not a linear process, even though we like to talk about the stages of grief. It's not linear, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So what do you were talking about acknowledging suffering connected to liberation. And I'm wondering what you imagine that could look like on a collective scale, right? Because you talked about it starting with the individual. What would it look like for us to actually prioritize space to grieve, or in order to find liberation or to feel joy, right? And acknowledge our grief? What could that look like?
Well, if I have to imagine it, I imagine that it takes place deep in nature, because nature is the thing that is going to hold us and support us unconditionally, no matter what. And I think that there needs to be space for people to voice what they're feeling without fear, and know that they won't be judged. You know, because a lot of times some of our grief is compounded by the very people who are closest to us. And a lot of times we feel like we can't speak about that. So, you know, being able to speak about things that are hurtful and painful and compounding your grief, you know, I think it just feels like love, being in a loving environment. And that's going to look different for everyone. You know, and I feel like the most, you know, what I can see happening is that different people who have different beliefs will gather in their own individual groups of healing. And then at some point, if they really move towards this place of feeling free, then they start to see that we're more alike than we are different. And then that starts to dissolve other places where we're not liberated and we're not free.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, you know, what conditions do you feel like need to be in place for your vision to come to fruition? Like what needs to shift? Or maybe it's already happening, right? You said if I have to imagine it, maybe it's already happening, right?
I feel like it is happening. I feel like it is happening. However, I also feel like there are many people who are not acknowledging their suffering. So it's like if you're here right now and you're listening to this call, like taking a moment just to close your eyes and acknowledge, where are you suffering? Where are you in pain? Where are those dark places that you haven't excavated in a while that you're ready to be free of, right? And then, you know, unfortunately, I think what happens is that if we don't look at our suffering, something happens to force us to look at our suffering, right? And so, you know, whether, and it's interesting because what I see happening is all of these things that happen in different communities, whether it's someone passing away tragically, or there's a school shooting, or there's some other sort of disaster like a fire, right, or a hurricane. It has that tendency to bond people together because everyone it can now realize that they're all suffering and it's the suffering that they have in common. And so what you start to see is people who never would have spoken to each other before, helping each other, saving each other's lives, because it's not about the color of someone's skin. It's about the fact that you see a human life for what it is. And you see that someone is suffering because you're also in the same situation suffering. And then it changes the dynamic. So if nature is going to give us disaster and things so that we can move into healing, if that is what's happening, and I'm not saying that it is, but it's definitely a way to look at it, then that's what's happening on a macro level. And then what we get to see is all of these little communities. You know, I see it in Topanga because that's where I live, and we're very susceptible to fires. And there's been fires all around us.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, you know, it's always been a tight-knit community, but it's become even tighter knit because it's not about if there's going to be a fire, it's about when and what is going to happen and how everybody has to be there to help each other. And so it's almost like this anticipatory grief of what could happen, of, you know, losing, you know, obviously people have grief over losing their homes and losing their possessions. What could happen? And how do we have to band together beforehand so that we're there for each other in the case that something tragic happens? So I do think that it's already happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
The problem is that people forget. They forget. That's the problem.
Yeah, we forget. And I'm curious about why it's like a natural disaster, why it needs to take that for us to actually recognize suffering and in the way you described, and then to come together around it and to support each other. It's like, I just am curious about why it has to be that. It's like something that's so massive that affects so many people, and why at times we can't see people's individual suffering. Like it takes something really big. It's like huge loss. It's a question I sit with. I'm confused about humans in that way.
I mean, I think our, you know, my personal belief is that we're too distracted. We're too busy scrolling on Instagram and Facebook and watching whatever, the Kardashians or something. And the reason why are we doing that? We're distracting ourselves from our suffering. from our pain. We're avoiding something. So the other question is, like, when you find yourself in the midst of like procrastination and distraction, what is it that you are actually avoiding? Right? Are you avoiding stepping into your power? Are you avoiding pain? There's so many different answers to that question, and I think they can all lead to more freedom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that, because I am human too, right? And it's not as if I notice suffering all the time, my own or others. And I certainly am distracted and avoid. And I just appreciate the curiosity that the question you offered around, well, what am I avoiding as I'm watching whatever stupid TV show I'm watching, right? Because it's not nourishing me or feeding me, mm-hmm. or my spirit or heart or soul. So what am I avoiding, and what is the nature of my own suffering in that moment, and what needs attention?
Right. And if you can't ask those questions and have the courage to see that in yourself, I don't believe that you actually have the discernment to see it in other people.
Right.
So that's really that's the practice. It's like, oh, if I like use myself as the guinea pig, then I can start to see what's really happening in the world. And so that's why I keep going back to, it starts with the individual.
Right. And deepening awareness. It's like self-awareness. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Work and practice.
Yeah. Practice is what keeps us from forgetting. Because when we don't practice, then we don't remember. And most of us don't have a practice. So it's like, if a disaster happens, we all band together. It's all like amazing to feel the love and all the energy and all the healing that can happen. But then it all dissipates and everybody goes back to the habits that they had before. There's very few people that actually create new habits based on the experience that they have.
Right.
Some people become activated by the experience, and it changes the course of their lives. And then those people kind of go on to help other people, do whatever, wake up in some way. But then the majority maybe are not changed and maybe get,
mm-hmm.
just back in the muck of life.
Yeah. I also know that I feel like you lost your dog recently. Is this true?
I did. That is true. Yes.
Bella. Okay. I was just wondering if you could share a lesson that Bella taught you, or lessons.
Oh, well, Bella's lesson was always be graceful. Bella was, he was a he, first of all,
mm-hmm.
but everyone thought that he was a she, because the name Bella, and also because of his grace and the way that he kind of walked around. But he was actually named after Bela Lugosi, the Hungarian actor.
Yeah.
And, really it was about grace and knowing when it was time to move on. He basically, he was very sick a couple of years ago, and we took him to this amazing doctor who's a human doctor, but his seva is working on animals, and he gave us this like incredible diet and all of these supplements, and we were hand making his food, and it extended his life for about 2 years. And we brought in another puppy to kind of give him some more energy. And at some point, it was like he told us, okay, it's time. And I'm gracefully going to exit this world. And I think that that's something that we struggle against, the reality that life is impermanent. And that if we're really practicing yoga, we are practicing to die gracefully. That every shavasana, we are, as one of my teachers, Gary Craftsall, says, we're dying to the world. We're dying to the world, so that, and we're returning to source, so that when we actually die, we can gracefully remember that we touched this source at one point and that there's nothing to fear.
Wow, that's beautiful. Yeah, I've never heard anyone describe Shavasana in that. It makes sense to me, and I've never heard anyone describe it in that way.
And in yoga in general, I mean, it's what we're doing in Yoga Nidra.
Yeah. Yes, because people are afraid to die. And so in general, right?
Well, we're not only afraid to die, but we're denying.
Right, that we're going to die.
Yeah, like every day we're closer to death. And so there's a whole beauty industry and plastic surgery industry and all of the supplement industry. All of these things are based on our fear and our denial. But I think that if you can do your practices around grief and be present, one of the most beautiful initiations there is in life is to be with someone when they take their last breath.
Yeah. How's that changed your life, like your experience of living day to day, this awareness that you're dying? You know, we're dying every minute of every day and that life is impermanent. How does that change the way you choose to live your life?
It definitely changes what I choose to say yes to and how quickly I can say no. You know, it really creates discernment around what's important.
And what feels most important to you right now?
Most important to me, my family feels very important. My family feels important, and being able to share what I've learned over the years and my understanding of what I've learned, because we can recognize our understandings are limited, but the understandings of the teachings that I've learned, to be able to share them is really important, because I recognize that I've been very privileged to be able to, you know, travel and study with some of the greatest teachers in the world, or at least in the United States for the most part. And I've received a lot in my 25 years of studying. And to be able to share that in any way that I can, even if it's with someone who's putting my eyelash extensions on, then I feel like I'm doing something in the world that's worthy of a life.
And this is my last question before I ask you to share how people can find you. It's really connected to what you just said. What do you want your legacy to be? Like once you leave your physical body, right? Or even live it, you're alive, right? And there's legacy being created now. What do you want it to be?
Love and inspiration, and understanding that you are powerful, and looking at being able to see the ways in which you give away your power, and being able to reclaim that and use it for something that is dharmic for you.
Well, thank you for creating that legacy now, right? It's not just something that will happen when you leave your physical body. It's happening now in the work you do and the practice and your offerings and teachings, which feels so profound and powerful, you know, to me and to many, right? And I'm wondering if you'll share how people can find you. It will also be on the webpage, but how people can find you. And also, this will come out at the end of January. So I'm wondering if there's stuff coming up in 2020 that you want to share with folks.
Yeah. So the easiest way to find me is just on my website, which is Tracee with 2 E's, yoga.com. And then coming up in April 12th through 17th, I have a 5-day retreat happening in Esalen, which is all about relaxing into your power. So it's basically yoga nidra and sankalpa, intention, manifestation. And then I have a workshop that I'm doing at Kripalu. And you can find that on my website. That's happening in May. And then in June, I'm going to be doing a yoga nidra retreat in nature. So it's basically yoga nidra, nature, and the elements, and working with the 24 gurus of Dattatreya. So that will be really interesting. I'm co-teaching that with Chanti Takarante Perez. And there's lots of other things. I'll be at Wanderlust and online, so people can find it, anything on my website.
Well, thank you for who you are, and thank you for saying yes to this conversation and yeah, this practice of talking about grief and liberation and suffering. And I just appreciate you. So thank you.
Thank you for asking me to be here. It's really important to me. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.